In this lesson, we're going to be covering the use of Trapcode Form to construct some of the design elements that you see here. Now, if I pause this and solo a few of these, all of these elements are created with Trapcode Form. And Trapcode Form is perfect for making some amazing looking, organic, flowing elements. It's a very diverse plugin, so the number of things we can create with this are very extensive. So I'll be going through these pieces one by one, constructing them from scratch so you can see how flexible and useful Trapcode Form is. And hopefully this will give you some ideas on how you can use Trapcode Form in your projects. Now let's take a look at where we're starting. I've just got a simple stock photograph of a car and a couple tires that are thrown on here. And the tires are in constant rotation with some motion blur to make them look like they're real tires. Also, I have a camera and just a simple solid as a black background. So this is what we're going to be dressing up and adding some flowing elements on top of this car. Now let's jump over to the finished product. And let's solo the first item that we'll be assembling here, which is this streaming lines right here. So we've got some multicolored lines that are twisted and have some variation in their position. And as these move from the car backward, we can see a little bit of dispersion going on. So a little more randomness as it moves away from the car rather than closer to the car. So let's jump over to our blank composition and start constructing this. We need a new solid, and we'll call this streaming lines. The color really doesn't matter. We'll just hit OK, and we'll apply the effect Trapcode Form. Now before we move forward, let's make sure that we all understand what Trapcode Form really is. Trapcode Form is a 3D particle system. The particles in Trapcode Form have no birth, life, or death cycle. So rather than emitting particles and becoming concerned with this birth and death cycle, we have a body of particles that we focus on. So you'll find that the controls within Trapcode Form are more geared towards affecting the whole body of particles, distorting them, twisting them, that kind of thing, rather than what the individual particle does. And in fact, you'll find that there are relatively few individual particle controls and a whole lot of control that we have to the whole group of particles. Now, this group of particles that we see by default is called a box grid because we have a grid of particles shaped like a box. By default, we get 3 of these boxes in Z. If I set this to 1, we'll see 1 box in Z. For this particular example, we're going to be using this setting called box strings. This will still be a body of particles, but instead of seeing a grid of particles, we will see a series of particles that form a string. Let me turn down the strings in Y here so we can see these strings a little bit better. So I've got 12 strings up and down, and these are formed by individual particles strung together. Now the fun starts when we get into, like I said, distorting the whole body of particles. First of all, let me turn up this size in X to make this a lot bigger. I'm going to make this 1200. And let's twirl that closed and go down to disperse and twist. So what I can do is take this whole body of particles and twist them like this. And I can also add some dispersion. What this is going to do is disperse the strings randomly. Right now they are evenly spaced and all perfect. I'm going to turn this disperse up to 7. And I'll add a little bit of randomness to the dispersion of these strings. I'm also going to move this over. I'm going to take the center X, Y and move this X over so that the side of the strings are sort of aligned with the front of the car. Now one of the things that I commonly do to take control over the shape of Trapcode Form is to take advantage of the spherical fields. Down here at the bottom, is closed, the spherical field actually has 2 controls, sphere 1 and sphere 2. If I use sphere 1 here, I can turn the strength up to push particles away from a spherical area. If I turn this down to a negative value, it will attract particles to a certain area. So this becomes a great way to pin down one of the sides of our form shape. So the strength can't go any lower than -100. What I need to do is turn up the radius. And actually, let me turn on Visualize Field here so I can see how big the area is. And it's actually pretty small. So I'll turn this radius up. And it will attract more and more particles to this point right here. Now, I'll turn off Visualize Field. And let's add some motion to this. If I go back to the base form here, you'll notice that we've got X, Y, and Z rotation. Now, this is rotation of the base form before it is twisted. So we'll see that the base form shape is going to be moving. However, the distortion of the twist is not going to be moving. So when we rotate things like Y rotation, we'll see some kind of unusual results if we're thinking of a straight rotation. We're not going to get an absolute rotation. We're getting a rotation of the base form before it's twisted, but this is not rotating the twist itself. What we can do is rotate the entire world in this transform world section if we need a true rotation. This will rotate everything in the world, including the twist. However, this allows us to add some shape variation to this by setting this to some rather low values to just add some undulation to the shape of this. Now I need to go back to my spherical field and turn up the radius just a little bit more. What I'm going to do is go into the rotation here under X rotation and add a constant rotation. What this is going to do is add sort of a flowing, streaming kind of look here. And as we'll see, sometimes we need to tweak the location of the spherical field as this rotates around. Usually takes a little bit of troubleshooting to get it to work. So let's reset this X rotation. And what I'm going to do is just set this X rotation into a constant spin. Now we could do this with keyframes, but I find this easier to do with a very simple expression. So I'm going to hold down the Option key, or Alt key in Windows, click on the stopwatch, and then in the X rotation, I'll type time times 180. Time is equal to our playback time in seconds, so at 2 seconds, the word time is equal to 2. And if that is multiplied times 180, our value at 2 seconds would be a full revolution. It's just an easy way of having a constantly increasing value over time. And then we can add a simple multiplier if we would like it to go quicker or slower rather than dealing with 2 keyframes at the beginning and end of the composition. So if I play this, we get a nice flowing animation. Now to add some color to this, there's a couple of ways we could do this. These strings are made of individual particles, so we could go into the particle controls and just change the color of the particle. However, this only gives us one color to choose from. So I'm going to use the quick maps, and this will allow me to define a whole map of colors. So if I'm going to tap the tilde keys and bring this full screen, I'm going to use a preset like this map right here. Just yellow to red and all these purples here. What I need to do is take this map and tell it which direction to apply it in Trapcode Form. Again, it's a 3-dimensional particle system. So I need to pick one axis to apply this map to. So if I apply it along the X, and if I zoom out here with my camera, so we can see the whole shape, we'll see that from the beginning to the end, we have the yellow through the red all the way to the purple over here. If I were to map this on the y-axis, it'll map it top to bottom. Depending on the twist, it'll be yellow to purple or purple to yellow. This is what I'm going to use here. I could go through and tweak this color map out to get it close to the original, or I can just go back to my original and copy this and go back to the one I'm working on now and hit paste just to get that same color map before. So now we've got our orange through the yellows and pinks and all that mapped in the y-axis on our strings here. So it's getting there. Now what I need to do is go into the particle type and change it from sphere to a glow sphere. Let's add a nice little glow to our look here. And I'm going to turn the opacity of the particles down. This will sort of start to thin things out a little bit. Now, it's looking a little thin, but what I'm going to do, because I'm working in a 32-bit color space. Now, Trapcode Form does not work in 32-bit color. As you can see, this little icon right here is warning me that I'm working in 32-bit color, and color precision may get all screwed up. However, I really like the use of a standard After Effects glow in conjunction with form in 32-bit color. It looks really good, especially if I turn the threshold down here, turn the intensity and the radius of this up. There's a nice soft glow to it. And the opacity of the particle doesn't need to be that high. In fact, this can be down something around 10. There we go. So it adds a nice glow to this. Now what I need to do is sort of adjust this point to match it up a little bit better with the car. Now I'm just going to use the transform world settings to do this. I'm going to nudge the offset just a little bit in X and Y. To get these to move in increments of 1, I'm holding down the Command key rather than using up and down, which will go in increments of 10. There we go, we're getting pretty close. Now, just to tweak this a little further, size the Y down a little bit so it's not quite as tall. Next, I'm going to add some dispersion in this. So as these lines trail away from the car, back here, they're going to start to sort of randomize a little bit. So if I close this up and go to the fractal field settings here, the fractal field essentially is like a turbulence field. It's always there. Rather than turning it on or off, what we do is define how much the particles are being affected by the fractal field. So we can have the fractal field affect the size or the opacity of the particles, or we can have it affect the position or overall displacement in X, Y, and Z of the particles. So now if I turn this up, this is going to affect the whole thing. So from front to back, it's displacing all of the particles. Now I'm going to set this to a value of 150, and it's going to displace these quite a bit. But what I'm going to do is control the strength of this fractal field over the x-axis. And we can do this in the quick maps. So again, the quick maps are a really flexible way of controlling the parameters across different axes in Trapcode Form. So we've been working with a color map. Now I'm going to use a spare map here, just map number 1. And we'll map this to the fractal strength, and we'll map this over the x-axis. So now if I twirl this open, and I use just a default map here, the value of the fractal strength over the x-axis is going to vary from one side to the other. In fact, I'm going to use more of a curved map like that. So over here, there's no fractal strength, and as we move further over in the x-axis, there will be more and more fractal strength applied to this. There we go. I'll tap the smooth key a couple times to smooth out that map. And let's back up a little bit. So toward the car we have some simple twisted strings, and as we move further back we're getting some fractal field distortion. Now to actually get that fractal field flowing in the x-axis, we're going to need to go back in the fractal field settings and look at its flow settings right here. It does have a little bit of evolution, which is this setting right here. So it is evolving in X, Y, and Z, but we can actually have it move in a certain direction and have it appear to sort of flow along the axis in which we want it to appear. So it's going to be flowing along the x-axis like so. Now, one thing we might want to take a look at if we are zoomed out far enough to see the edge of the strings is to go into the string settings under the base form right here and taper the end of the strings off. And we can do this with the size and the opacity. I'm going to use the taper size function, set it to smooth, and taper off the ends of those strings. And that pretty much wraps it up for this design element. Let's move on to another one where we create a bubble around the vehicle itself. Now if I go back to the main composition, this is pretty much what it looks like. So sort of a bubbly shape around here, and as it trails back, it's going to get some fractal field distortion. So let's create a new solid. We'll call this the bubble, and apply Trapcode Form. So I'm going to go and turn on my AV Features columns and turn off these streaming lines for the time being. Just trying to save some room here, so I'll hide that column again. And we're just looking at the bubble. So I'm going to go into the base form, and instead of using the box grid or the box strings, we're going to use a sphere. So we have 3 layered spheres in here. I'm going to turn this down to just 1. And I'll adjust the size in X and its center to sort of align with the car. Let's zoom in a little bit to give you a better view of this. Just like we did with the strings and we applied some fractal field distortion, we're going to do the same thing with this sphere. So if I go into the fractal field and I turn the displacement up, we'll be displacing the whole sphere. But as you learned, we can go into the quick maps and quickly control the fractal strength over the x-axis from front to back. So the maximum amount of displacement that we're going to get with this fractal field is this value right here. It's never going to get any more than this value. So we need to make sure to have this high enough so at the highest point we're going to have the maximum amount of fractal field displacement. Now at this point you're probably noticing that this is really just kind of a grid of particles mapped to a sphere. It's really not that smooth. Well, this is intentional. I'm working with a very low particle count right now to keep things moving quickly. This is one of the most common questions I get with Trapcode Form, is how to speed up the interactivity with it. Now, we can crank up the particles in the base form to give this a nice smooth look, because right now we have particles in X and Y set to 70. Ultimately, these are going to end up somewhere around 500 and 500 to give a nice smooth look to this. However, there's a lot more particles, and to get this to interact and render on the fly is going to be a lot slower. So I tend to work with a fairly low particle count to get my settings all tweaked, including color, before I reach for this particle count here to smooth things out. So before we go there, let's set our color. So I'm going to go into the quick maps under our color map here. And I'll select this map right here and just pull off a few colors. I'm just going to end up with a yellow to red color, and I'm going to map this color over the x-axis, and I'm going to flip these. So if I go in here, I can just click on flip and flip it so that the yellow goes to red. Now I'm going to have this fade out just a little bit from front to back. So it'll be more opaque over here and less opaque over here. Just like we did with fractal strength, we can go in and set a separate map to be mapped to the opacity in the x-axis. And if I start with this, it's actually faded out here and then more opaque here. I want to flip this back around, so I'm just going to click flip. And now we've got more opaque particles here, and then they fade as we go back. This is pretty much what I'm looking for. So now we're pretty much at the point where I can go in and increase these particles in X and Y to smooth this thing out. Let's see if 600 by 600 gives us a smooth enough shape. Yep, it's pretty much getting there. Now, what I need to do is turn the particle opacity way down. This is looking pretty hot. And by default, these particles are using an add transfer mode. So in the areas where the particles overlap, these colors are blending together with this transfer mode, which is fine. It actually looks very good, but we don't need an opacity of 100%. We'll find that this actually can be pretty low and still get some decent results. I'm going to bring down the size just a little bit so it's matched a little better to the car, and we'll adjust the center to move it down. Just like that. Now I'm going to set this whole layer to be set to a hard light transfer mode so it blends with the car just a little bit. And we just need to tweak it to taste. In fact, I think this particle opacity can come down even more. So the one last thing is to add some fractal field flow in the x-axis. I'm going to set this to 500 just like we did with the strings. So now we get a nice organic, smoky, fiery sort of flow to this shape here. And I think this looks pretty cool. Now, if we want to adapt this a little better to the shape of the car, one thing we can do is go into Distort and apply Liquify. And what I can do is sort of smudge this shape and distort it so that it's a little more mapped to the shape of the car. The downside is that if I want to look at this from any other angle, because this is a 3D particle system, we're going to lose this sort of distortion. But the Liquify tool works really well. We're looking for a very specific shape. So I'm just going to leave this set like that for now. So now if we turn both of these back on, we've got both the streaming lines and the little bubble coming off of the front here. Now I'm going to add another type of bubble on here that extends a little bit further back and has a little more of a fire kind of look to it. So let's turn these off for a second and create a new solid. This will be our fire layer, and we'll apply Trapcode Form. This is going to be pretty similar to the bubble that we set up before, so I'm going to do this fairly quickly. Go to Sphere Layered, set this to 1, and size this out. Now I'm going to make this a lot bigger actually, and set this back here. Now we want some fractal field distortion on the displacement. Now if we go down here, we have this fractal sum right now that defaults to a setting called noise. We have another one that is called absolute noise. Now if you know what absolute values are, you don't want me explaining them. And if you don't know what absolute values are, you still probably don't want me explaining them. In the context of Trapcode Form, you can think of absolute noise as more of a fire type of shape. Now to see this, I do need to smooth things out here, so I'm going to have to jump the gun early and turn up my particles in X and Y. So let's sort of A/B these. This is the default setting. A little more organic, a little more flowing. And the absolute noise setting looks like this. I tend to think this looks a little more water and fire-like. And it works really well for fire type settings. So I'm going to set a fairly orange and red color map to be on this. Let's close these things up here. Go to our quick maps, color map. And let's just use these default settings here. There we go. Map this over X. And let's flip these. And I'll set the particle opacity to be fairly low, and I think we're going to need to turn the particle count up even more to get this very smooth. I'm going to double it in X and in Y. Starting to look pretty fire-like. Now, what I like to do is actually sort of notch out the center so we can see through to the car in there. And we're also going to need to do the same thing we've done, which is map the fractal strength in the x-axis. So let's quickly do that. Let's go into the map here, select fractal strength over the x-axis, and just use a simple map like that. And I'm going to use another map here on the opacity over y, up and down. So I'm going to add a little bit of a visible area in the center here. Now, actually, what I need is the inverse of this map right here. Unfortunately, there's no way to flip this upside down, so I have to draw this manually. So I'm going to get out my stylus here and try to draw a quick inverted bell curve like this. And I'll sort of notch a area out in the center here. Let's turn down the opacity even more on the particles. And let's turn the size down just a little bit because it looks a little stretched out. And one last thing, I'm going to go in and turn up the fractal field displacement even more so we get some really heavy distortion over on this side. There we go. And again, I'm going to use liquefy. And push this around the tires and shape this to the hood a little better. There we go. And I think that yellow needs to be a little more orange. So let's go in here under the quick map and I'll change this to a little more of an orange. There we go. So it's looking pretty good. So if we want, we could have both of these on or mix and match however you want it. I'm going to turn on this other bubble that you see right there. Sort of mixes them together, and then we turn on the streaming lines. There we go. It's starting to get a little bit heavy. And actually, I think in these streaming lines here, we might want to add an opacity map to have it fade out toward the front here, because you don't want it getting too busy. Let's go on the quick maps here, and our first open map is map number 2. We'll select the opacity over X and draw a little map like that. There we go. So it's not as heavy right here over the car. Next, we're going to create some fairly solid-looking sweep elements like this. These are very subtle, but I think they add quite a bit to this, and these can be very useful design elements. This is actually very similar to the streaming lines we did earlier, but we're going to this is actually going to be pretty similar to the streaming lines that we did earlier. So this should go pretty quickly. So I'm going to create a solid, and we'll just call this sweep 1, because we'll end up making 2 of these. And go to Trapcode Form. And let's solo this layer. And turn off the transparency checkerboard. Let's go to the base form, go to box strings, set the strings in Z to 1, and size the X up quite a bit. Now, rather than seeing individual strings like we did before when we turned this way down, we actually want a fairly small size in Y and a fairly dense number of strings in Y to make this look pretty solid. Now, I'm going to jump in and apply some color to this. We'll start with this and have a fairly colorful map here, and we'll apply this in the Y-axis and add some twist. Now let's go up to the rotation here and just add a little bit of additional rotation to vary the shape up a little bit. And we'll move the center over to the point where we can see the edge of it. And again, we want to use a spherical field. This is very useful to pin this one side down. So we'll set this to a negative value and turn on the visualize field and move location over here. So I'm just going to turn the radius up, give a fairly strong pinning to that. We'll just add some constant rotation to this. And we obviously need to turn up the spherical field quite a bit. This is pretty common, actually. This usually needs some tweaking of both the position itself as well as the radius. Let's keep. Now at this point, we can see how much we can turn down the strings in Y before we start getting any sort of moire pattern in there. Just to save on render time, but not compromise on our quality. So I got to kind of adjust this just to the point where I see that pattern go away. Another thing we can do to smooth that out is turn the particle type into a glow sphere. So it sort of smears together the particles and will give you a little bit less of that moire pattern. And then ultimately, I'll turn the particle opacity down. This gives you a nice, smooth looking shape like this. Now I'm going to duplicate this and just make a separate one of these. And actually, I'll call this sweep number 2. And what I want to do is offset this by 90 degrees. So in this rotation here, I'm just going to add at the end plus 90. So we'll have a second one that's kind of offset by 90 degrees. And we can vary the color on this. Maybe we'll make this one of the blue maps right there. Now I'm going to put this behind the car. And I need to turn off the visualize field for both of these. I left that on. Visualize field off. And visualize field off for this one. There we go. Let's use the transform world function to move these sweeps down. Let's just solo these two and the car. Offset Y. Let's push it downward. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning, you're probably not going to want all of these on at the same time as I'm making them. The goal here is to sort of get your brain plugged into how Trapcode Form works and how you can make different types of these flowing organic elements and mix and match and create your own and perhaps turn some of them off to add a little bit of a taste filter here. Let's turn that one off. Now, a variation on this bubble, like here, there's one more way that we can do this. And this is actually the original way that I created it. And I kind of went back and decided that a sphere shape might look a little better. But I just want to show you one more variation on this bubble. And it gets into some different settings within Trapcode Form. So let's call this bubble 2, and I'm going to solo this. What we haven't done so far in Trapcode Form is use the actual default base form, which is this box grid. Again, I'm going to turn the particles in Z down to 1. And I'll turn the size X and Y up. And we'll come back to the particles in X and Y to smooth out the shape. But what I'm going to do is use the spherical field to push particles away. And if I turn this radius up, we can end up with a fairly nice round shape. So to this, I can go in and apply a nice little color map along X and add some fractal field distortion here. So I'll have this affect the displacement of the particles and have it flow along the X. 500 seems to be working pretty well so far. So it's kind of this flowing force field kind of look. Now, let's smooth this out in X and Y. And turn down particle opacity. Again, I tend to work with a fairly low particle opacity in Trapcode Form. Let's adjust the base size just a little bit more so we don't have so much trailing off there. And let's add a little bit of fade from left to right. So go into the quick maps here. Map opacity over X and use front to back fade like that and flip this. Let's adjust that a little bit more so we have a little less on that one side there. Now, the downside here is because I'm making this shape with the spherical field, I do not have the ability to adjust the spherical field. It's just one of those things that is not within Trapcode Form. Spherical field is always a perfect sphere. So one workaround is to just take this shape and physically distort it like this, distort the solid to get it a little more of the shape of the car. However, if you've got some camera moves and all that, this might not work out for you. But this can yield a nice look that's a little bit different than the sphere that we made with the base form sphere. And I just thought I'd mention that as the way that I originally did this, and I wanted to drop that in there so you could see this. And we just need to sort of tweak this back into place. And that concludes this lesson. I hope I've inspired you to take a deeper look at Trapcode Form so you can use it in your own projects. As you can see, it can generate some amazing results. So, my name's Harry Frank for Studio Daily. Thanks for watching.